Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Spalding, Associate Vice President and Dean for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. An important aspect of learning about the Constitution, which we emphasize at Hillsdale, is to know something about American political history, both in terms of seeing models for application of ideas, but because there are often lessons in American politics that can be applied today. Much of American politics, on both the left and the right, is about how ideas and movements interact with politics and especially political parties. What we are seeing today with the incoming new speaker is in many ways an aspect of that and the effect of it over time. Indeed, of late, both political parties have been affected by populist elements, populist movements, and populist candidates. Is that past prologue? I'm very happy to have a guest and good friend of ours to come and talk about that subject and knows much about the topic. To formally introduce our speaker, one of our students are currently on the WHIP program, Anna Pfaff, will speak to us. She's a senior studying American Studies at Hillsdale College. She's currently interning at the American Principles Project. She's a member of the Chi Omega sorority and is also a member of the nationally ranked Hillsdale College shotgun team.
Thank you, Dr. Spalding. Henry Olsen is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his research focuses on the electoral challenges facing modern American conservatism. In particular, Mr. Olsen studies election returns and poll data to understand why people vote the way they do and how conservative politicians can advance their ideas in current political climate. Mr. Olsen previously served as a vice president and director of the American Enterprise Institute's National Research Initiative, a vice president at the Manhattan Institute, and president of the Commonwealth Foundation. He has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, and is the co-author with Dante Scala of the forthcoming The Four Faces of the Republican Party, The Fight for the 2016 Presidential Nomination. In tandem with his new book, Olsen is currently blogging for National Review Online at 2016, The GOP's Four Faces. He received his BA from Claremont McKenna College and his JD from the University of Chicago Law School. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Henry Olsen.
Anna. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Matthew. It's genuinely an honor to be asked to talk in this hall, surrounded by so many founders whose images I'm unworthy to live up to. But such is the challenge of working or speaking at Hillsdale, where one is always surrounded by the promise and the opportunity to live up to the ideal set by our American founders. My talk today is about populism, past and prologue, but populism is not something that is thought of very positively today. In fact, for many, it is a specter. And we know that Spectre is the title of the next James Bond movie, but for most people, populism is a specter that haunts and frightens, and particularly the American elites are frightened by the specter of populism that they see rising throughout our country today. In fact, I would say that if there's any one word beyond perhaps Nazi or communist that is a negative attribution in American politics, it is the word populism, or populist. If there is anything an educated person is taught, it is that populism is irrational, angry, often bigoted or racist, and that to be a populist in the American political tradition, say in the akin of the Populist Party of the 1890s, is to be beyond the pale of reasonable discourse. Yet despite this universal elite condemnation, the three most energetic political movements today, progressivism, Tea Partyism, and what I will call Trumpism, are all of distinct populist elements. They're all animated, energized by things that are classically populist in the American vein. If every person who said they were a supporter of one of these three movements, instead of being divided, were united and were to stand on one side of this room, nearly half of Americans would be populist. So if half of Americans are populist, then one of two things must be true. Either the classic elite view of populism is correct and American politics is crashing down around us, In fact, one sees this sense in much media commentary about the current political circumstance. Or another thing might be true. Populism is not toxic to America. The first may be true, and we'll get to that later in my lecture. But I think the second is undoubtedly true, that while classical populism of the sort that has brought us throughout history, the Greek tyrants, which Aristotle and Plato wrote about, which produced in our modern times Lenin and Hitler and Perón and Hugo Chavez, is toxic. American populism is in fact not only not toxic, it is essential to the glue that holds American democracy and human passion together. That what it does, American populism has distinct elements that channel human passion, something ineradicable, to the goals of the founding and in fact make human liberty possible in a democratic environment. So today's lecture, I'm going to try and discuss and address three different things. I'm going to try and show what I just argued, that all enduring American political coalitions are in fact classically American populist in their origin. And that secondly, today's populist movements are in fact merely modern variations of the same theme, which is to say, they are not toxic to the American political discourse, no matter what one might read in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. But third, that none is currently constituted, is prepared to become an enduring coalition in America, precisely because one of the elements of American populism, a positive agenda that actually addresses the root cause that set in force the populist demand for populist elements, is not met by any of them. None of them have a positive agenda that directly relates to the problems that are giving rise to the populist appeal in our current time. Let me first start with the first argument, which is probably the most contentious among political theorists or political scientists, and if I were one, I would have to write a book or two or three to respond, or maybe many articles, depends where I'm in the tenure process. I think if you look throughout American politics, political history, one would find that there are four elements of American populism. The elements that I call the dispossession, the creation of the other, the reconquest, and the agenda. Let me go into each of those and what I mean by those. By the dispossession, I mean that the first element is that a large mass of American people feel that they have been wrongly prevented or wrongly held back from their ability to pursue their own happiness. This is perhaps the central theme of American political life. That Americans are united by the belief that through their own efforts and with the assistance of a democratically elected government, they can, if properly enabled, pursue their own happiness, whether that is in material terms or religious terms or in some other term, or usually some combination of that. The populist moment comes when a large mass and perhaps a majority feel that they have been wrongly dispossessed of their ability to pursue their birthright as Americans. The creation of the other is the second element. Once one feels that they are dispossessed, the movement, the grouping, comes to believe that that dispossession is the cause of a other that has controlled American government. That other can be economic, as it was in many aspects of our American history. It can be political, as it was during the Reagan era, which I'll make that argument momentarily. It can be socio-political, much as Lincoln's argument about Southern aristocrats and their Northern allies, what they call dough faces, was. But the sense is that a other that is alien, that no longer believes in American principles, has taken control of the government and has thereby caused the dispossession. The reconquest, well, that's pretty obvious. Put one and two together, and the solution is when the people rule, as Andrew Jackson said in 1832 and is often said, restore the rule of the people, remove the rule of the other, and the American dream can continue. This has, in fact, been the central element of every one of our political coalitions. And the agenda is the actual serious set of policies that connects the moral sense of dispossession to the action of what we will do when we reconquer. And the agenda is always something that involves the recreation of the individual's ability to pursue happiness on their own. It is never a Peronist agenda. It is never a Hitlerian agenda. It is never a state-dominating agenda. It is always one that whether or not it ends up in fact to be that way, and that's a question about the New Deal that I'll address, it is always both understood by the public and couched to the public in terms of the recovery of the right to pursue happiness on your own. So let's go through American history and see whether or not those four elements are in fact present in what most political scientists would say are the reigning coalition. We often hear about realigning elections. And what a realigning election does is it installs one set of political actors who more or less hold dominant sway over the national government for a period of 30 to 40 years. Most political observers have said that we've had a realigning election in 1800 when Jefferson dispossessed the Federalists, and Jeffersonian democracy ruled for the next 20 so years. In 1832, when Jackson recreated and reformed the Jeffersonian coalition to basically rule until the onset of the Civil War. 1860, when Abraham Lincoln recreated, with the aid of many others, the Republican Party and applied what I would argue classic Jefferson-Jacksonian populist elements to dispossess the Jeffersonians themselves from rule. 1932, when Roosevelt created the New Deal coalition, and I would argue 1980 was in fact a realigning election, although not one exactly or classically as understood by political scientists, because the dominance took a while to exert itself, i.e. Republicans did not take control of the national government until much later in the process, but dominated the ideas under which all political coalitions operated throughout that era. For the Jeffersonian, the dispossession occurred during the reign of Adams. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically criminalized political criticism, and the Hamiltonian economics that they pursued were considered by Jefferson and Madison and what they called then the Republicans, or what we now know as the Democratic Republicans, as being anathema to the Republic's ideals and principles. They created the idea of the other. The other was the wealthy, usually New England merchant who were trying to reinstitute rule of English principles under American forms. And in fact, the election of 1800 was perhaps the most vicious rhetorically that we've ever had in this country. Jefferson himself, as intellectually able as he was not above calling his opponents Anglo-men and monocrats and alleging that they wanted to abolish the Constitution. The 1800 election was close, but it resulted in victory, a victory which was then reaffirmed in every single election for the next 24 years. And the agenda was simple. It was not to take the property of the people. It was not to, as was done with the Tories, who supported the king, drive them out of the country, which is what a classic populist movement might do. Instead, it was to repeal the offending acts and to recover the American sense of citizenship. Jefferson's first inaugural included the famous phrase, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," which is to say, yes, we disagree with you. Yes, we think that you wanted to up in the Constitution, but you have rights too. You are Americans. We will simply remove your rule, which prevented people from pursuing happiness, and then we will go on with the constitutional way of life. The second realigning election was Jackson's, and he followed the classic principles, only simply adapted to the issues of the day. Instead of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the question was the National Bank of America, whose charter was coming up for renewal. This is something that's kind of like a super Federal Reserve, but in many ways even more pernicious than what a Paulite might call a Federal Reserve, because rather than simply control the money supply, it actually made investments and underwrote private banks. So it was almost as if it was intended, I believe, by Hamilton to be the undergirder of a national industrial policy, what we would call it today. And the people who were allied with the bank also wanted to use federal tax dollars to have internal improvements, canals and railroads to pay for industrial expansion. Jackson and the Democrats argued this was wrong. This was setting the rule of the rich over the rule of the people. It was creating what we would now call crony capitalism. And they created the other, the New York banker, the New England merchant, the Philadelphia lawyer, the people who were, in fact, the ones who were moving for these systems and who would financially benefit for these systems. Nobody can ever write a better critique of crony capitalism than Andrew Jackson wrote in his veto message of the National Bank, detailing exactly who would benefit and how they would benefit financially from this, and arguing that the American birthright meant that this could not stand. The American people agreed with him. 1832, he won. The bank was killed, and except during eras of economic unrest after, say, the Panic of 1839, Democrats ruled the national government almost interruptedly. And in fact, by 1854, the main political party that supported this, the Whigs, had died. The agenda, again, was not positive in the sense of it was not a confiscatory agenda. It was not one that drove these people out of the body politic. It was not classically populist. It was American populist. It removed the barriers and said, now we will get on with our lives. Lincoln. And by 1860, obviously, we had a question with slavery, a small squabble over a peculiar institution. I jest, of course. This is something that, in Lincoln's terms, was not simply a moral abomination and a wrong, not simply opposed to our principles of a free nation, but one that was directly threatened the ability of free labor and free men to pursue their own happiness. His House Divided speech, in fact, argued that there was a conscious conspiracy between the past president, the sitting president, his opponent, Stephen Douglas, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Roger Taney, not to prevent the extirpation of slavery in the South, but to extend slavery to the North. That the principles of the Dred Scott decision could not be limited to the existence of slavery in the South. They had to extend to the North, and that meant that your ability as an American to pursue happiness was directly at threat. The other was obvious, the Southern slaveholder and the Northern dough-face. Again, though, the agenda was one that was, in fact, non-confiscatory in its original terms. Lincoln did not, and the Republican platform did not want to take slaves and drive Southerners out of the body politic. They wanted to pay for the emancipation of slaves. Only the advent of the Civil War changed that. And the other aspects of the Republican economic agenda, a land grant college act to spread knowledge of agricultural technique, the Pacific Railroad Act that underwrote the creation of a transcontinental railroad, the Homestead Act that gave free land to people to move into the new territories, were all designed to give people in the modern age tools by which they could pursue happiness. That was how it was sold. That was how it was understood. And the Lincoln coalition ruled for roughly 72 years with only a couple of interruptions. Then, of course, the Great Depression arises. Obviously, that created political pressures. Roosevelt responded by, again, arguing that you have been dispossessed by a system of tariffs and greedy industrialists who have displaced the American founding and placed their rule of property over your ability to pursue happiness. He called his foes economic royalists. He called the industrialists unscrupulous money changers of the temple, invoking both biblical and secular imagery to rally people to his cause. They were the other. And the victory was almost complete. By 1936, Republicans had been reduced to fewer than 15% of the members of the House of Representatives, the smallest percentage that any major party has ever held in the House of Representatives. Again, though, one can argue what the New Deal actually did or whether it was something that had seeds of its own destruction built within it, but it was both sold to the American people and initially constructed in a way to allow people to move in a modern industrial age to help themselves. The Wagner Act, for example, which required labor union bargaining, was an imposition and a violation of American constitutional tradition. But it was nowhere near as extreme as things that social democrats did to basically allow unions to set wages themselves. It was meant to level the playing field. And in fact, American unions have always, even at their heyday, had less power than unions in more overtly social democratic countries. The same is true of Social Security. Unlike many other social democratic countries that basically made the creation of a guaranteed national minimum income the requirement of their state, Social Security prevented people from falling into deprivation, but allowed them to rise. It was more of what we call a safety net than a hammock. Again, we can argue whether or not the New Deal, in fact, had seeds of its own destruction or seeds that were contrary to that, but it was both crucially sold as and understood by the American people as being simply new means to achieve traditional ends. And then we step into Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan angers the left precisely because in political modern history, he is the first leader who takes the classical populist elements and turns them towards conservative, traditionalist, constitutional ends. For him, the 70s, the collapse of the economy, the collapse of the sense of American exceptionalism, the fear of conquest by Soviet communism is what were the forces that drove the demand for him. The other, in his case, was something unusual in American history, but simply a new adaptation of old ends, the bureaucrat. How many times did Ronald Reagan rail against central government control, bureaucratic control that was taking away your ability to pursue happiness and substituting central government dictate? What he essentially did was keep the same template, but replace the industrialist with the bureaucrat as the person who was holding back Americans from thriving and pursuing their birthright to pursue happiness. Again, 1980 is the election that is key. After 1980 and the subsequent victories in Congress, everyone, even Democrats, must work on Reaganistic tones. That was the point of the New Democratic movement. That was the point of how Clinton was elected, was that he was not an old Democrat who opposed Reaganism. He was a new Democrat who sought to modify Reaganism, but not repeal it. And what were the agenda items? Deregulation, rearmament, tax cuts. They were not ideological crusades. There were many who were disappointed that Social Security was not significantly repealed or reformed. Today, there are still people who look back and say, well, government grew under Ronald Reagan as a size of the economy. It shrunk as a regulatory matter, but as a size of the economy, it grew. What would Reagan accomplish? But again, the agenda met the times. The agenda solved the problems which gave rise to the demand for the populist moment. So all of these coalitions share the same elements and can be understood as using these elements that classically tie human passions, fears, and hopes and beliefs of others and non-others, of the in and the out, and ties it to human liberty, as opposed to what other regimes who don't have this structure and don't have our political understanding do, which is allow those passions to destroy the regime and establish some form of tyranny. Part two, each of these movements that we see today are employing the same technique. For Bernie Sanders, it's pretty obvious. I mean, he's trying to recreate Rooseveltism in our times, only instead of having the sort of self-help measures that the New Deal, he's explicitly saying that the problem with America is that we have economic decline. It's being caused by the greedy bankers and financiers. If the people take over, we will do this, and we will do it by making ourselves look like Denmark. So I would argue those are three of the classical elements, but that the policy solution ultimately falls flat because what it does is it replaces a European sense of the role of the citizen with the state for the American one. It does not speak as much in terms of the American ability to pursue happiness as it does installing the government's ability and to ensure that no person falls below and everyone has some form of adequacy. It replaces a people-centric pursuit of happiness with a state-centric pursuit of happiness. It's for this reason that I think that Sanders' progressivism will ultimately not form a stable political coalition. I think we've seen elements and proof of that in the form of which Barack Obama has pursued this. He has definitely not pursued it in as forthright a manner or as direct a manner as Sanders, hence the cause in the Democratic Party for his challenge. But nevertheless, through Obamacare, through Dodd-Frank, through his attempts to bring about climate change regulation and other elements of the government, he has tried to create an idea that Americans need to be directed by the government in their pursuit of happiness, as opposed to allowing the pursuit of happiness to be determined primarily outside of public and collective decision-making. This is the source of why the Republicans won in 2010. This is why the Republicans won in 2014, and it remains the classic sense of why Republicans can win is because Americans, even today, do not want that. They do not want a state-directed government. They do not want a state-directed society. They may want and do want many things that many people in this room may consider to be unconstitutional, but they do not want what progressives tell them they want. And they will react and have reacted at the ballot box every time it becomes clear that that is what the agenda is since the New Deal in 1932. The second sort that we have is Trump-centrism. And Trump-centrism, again, rises from the sense of economic stagnation, declining wages. His other is immigrants and people who are, and the government-business alliance that's conspiring to send jobs overseas. So his solution is throw out the immigrants, install a wall, and renegotiate trade agreements. That's his positive agenda. That ostensibly has more in common with the Republican small r sentiment of the American political tradition, because it says if we do this, you can pursue your own happiness again. But at the heart of this is a caudillism, that a sense that only the strong man can produce this. The man who knows the art of the deal. This is constantly Trump's position, that only by investing basically all power in me can you be able to pursue your happiness. There's an inherent contradiction here. And there's also the question in our American political tradition whether or not classic Peronism, which is a more socialist version of what Trump is proposing, is in fact possible in American politics. I don't think Trump ultimately will become the nominee, but even if he were elected president, I don't think that his coalition would last, because it's basically at odds with the American political tradition, and the economics that he proposes won't work. That a short-term gain would produce a long-term decline if you built a wall and forced American industry to come back home. That is the Peronist Argentine solution. That is one that ultimately will put America on a course for decline. And you cannot produce the short-term gains that he says, higher wages and more jobs for low-skilled people, without having that sort of autarkic economic regime. The agenda does not mesh with our political tradition. It does not address the problem of our time. So then what about Tea Partyism? I think the Tea Partyism, again, arises from a similar sense, only, again, following Reagan fashion. The sense of economic decline and stagnation is blamed by the Obama presidency. That the Obama presidency has raised taxes, it's increased regulation, it's increased the size of government. That's the cause of our problem. What we need to do is in some way deal with the undoing of Obamaism. Where I think, and in that sense, it's classically American, but where I think Tea Partyism fails is the lack of a serious agenda to actually address the problem, which is to say, what part, aside from Obamacare, of Obamaism is really to blame? You know, it's not like economic stagnation didn't exist for millions of people during the Bush years either. Many people, disability rolls skyrocketed during the Bush growth years. People sunk into dependency at the lower ends of the economic spectrum during growing years under Republican control. There's no real sense among the Tea Party political agenda that addresses those very real questions. So one example of, I think, the unreality of the agenda is Cruz's tax plan that he released yesterday. I looked that up before I came, and he proposes eliminating the payroll tax, the 7.65% that you and your employer pay for Social Security and Medicare, and replacing all personal income taxes with a 10% flat tax. And he has certain deductions, and he exempts the first $36,000 of income from every family. And he blithely asserts that this will produce as much revenue as was raised before. There's no possible way that can be true. There is no possible way that can be true. The amount of revenue that the taxes he proposes to reform or eliminate equals nearly 80% of the government's budget. A 10% flat tax at best will raise half of that. So your solution is either borrow money in the next decade while the economy allegedly grows because of this new regime to make the deficit under the Obama administration look like small castles in the sand. Or your solution is to basically cut the size of the federal government by 35% in 1 year to bring the deficit down to acceptable levels. This is not a serious platform. There's no demand to cut the federal government by 35% in 1 year, and there's no will to make the deficit be $1.8 trillion a year as far as the eye can see. This is not a serious platform, and as such, it cannot, even if elected, produce the enduring coalition that the Tea Party, as expressed by Ted Cruz, wants. The main problem we have today is what I call the problem of the ins versus the outs. And it's one that is spreading throughout the Western world. And it's a direct result of the promise and the beauty of capitalism. Now, what we've seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall is the opening of more people to the Western democratic liberal capitalistic system than has ever been seen before. Between 1989 and 1994, when NAFTA was signed, between India liberalizing its economy to be open to foreign trade, between the tigers of East Asia being open to foreign trade, between China being open to foreign trade, Eastern Europe being open to foreign trade, and then Mexico, over 3 billion people were added to the global Western democratic economy. At the time, the total population of the developed world was 900 million. We tripled the labor force in 5 years. And what has been the result of that? The result of that, since that time, has been the eradication of poverty in much of the third world. The only places where we have huge numbers of extreme poverty, as defined by UN and organizations, remains in those countries whose political systems remain closed to Western investment, mainly in Africa, but in some other countries as well. Western liberal democratic capitalism has brought more personal freedom, more personal comfort, and more personal dignity to more people in the last 25 years than has been accomplished throughout human history. But this has not come without a cost. As we bring people into the labor force, they necessarily come into competition with people who are already in the labor force. And those of us are not in competition very much yet. But the person who dropped out of high school, or the person who only has a high school degree, whether they're in Sweden or whether they are in Sandusky, are in competition. And in the world of a welfare state, that means that it becomes economically viable for them to absent themselves from the labor force. And that's happening in Europe, where it's an explicit policy, and it's happening here, where it's an implicit policy. That's what's driving the demand for populist movements in Europe. That's what's driving the demand for populist movements in America. Populism in Europe is different. I'm not going to deal with that in this lecture. But in this country, the populist movement is, as it always is, the belief that Americans, if only the government were on their side, would be able to pursue happiness. That is what underlies all three of the populisms today. And when we address the real problem, which is not to cut off liberal democratic international capitalism, but rather, as was done at the beginning of the 20th century, to accommodate our political order so that all people can share in some measure and not be dispossessed by these developments, then we will have an enduring political coalition. An enduring political coalition that secures liberty, secures growth, and secures the right to pursue happiness for Americans while saving billions of people overseas. And that is the promise of American populism. That is what all three movements are trying desperately to grasp towards. And the first one that gets there will probably be on the right, but the first one that gets there will be the next dominant coalition, will have the next realigning election, and will define the course of the next American century. I'm open to your questions. Since I'm judge, jury, and executioner, I have the watch. I have 22 minutes, I'm told, until Matt tells me I need to cut time. So I'll take your questions, please. I said nothing provocative, so I understand why there's no question. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Have progressively detached themselves from the concerns, really, of the normal American person, or everyday person,
I think that's a different way and perhaps a more complete way of talking about what I'm trying to get at, which is that there's a sense more and more that there is an other that is disassociated with the mass, and people are interpreting it differently. But yes, I would say that the thing that unites all populisms is the sense that the people who are running things, and they differ as to who those people are, but there's a united sense that the people who are running things no longer care about them, no longer understand them, and no longer care to understand them. Yeah, you want to have a follow-up, and then I'll turn it over? I think we're seeing worldwide a sense, there's a sense, I study elections all over the world. And if I were to plop myself down in the most educated and richest district in England, which is the cities of Westminster, the capital of London, I would find attitudes that are internationalist and contemptuous of the average person and non-nationalist that are every bit as strong as I would find in the Harvard campus or in the boardrooms of Wall Street. I would find this in Stockholm. I would find this in the Palais Élysée. I would find this everywhere. There is a global in, and it produces a global out. And the sense of nationalism and the sense of the dignity of the individual is something that is being felt, is being undermined everywhere. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Can you wait for the microphone? I didn't realize this at first, but they have a microphone coming around. Thank you.
Yeah. So you said that in sort of in the American character, there's this sense of that it's individuals as opposed to the state, and that do you think that that is a fixed factor of the American character? Because it seems to me that on the American left, there are more and more people that do have a more European sense of their place. And so I think there probably is still a majority of Americans that see it that way, whether they're right or left. But is that changing, or could that change?
Oh, I think it could change. It has endured over 200 and something years, and it is primarily the source of why we've never had a socialist or a communist or an openly Marxist party in America. There's simply not enough fertile soil. I think it's quite clear that elements of the left have gained popular support, and that there's probably more people today than there were 30 years ago or 60 years ago who openly would pine for a more state-directed. But I don't think there's anything that suggests that that's anywhere near a majority yet. The electoral problem conservatives often face is lumping together as the other, the people who seek to take what I will call the popular New Deal and see that as a legitimate expression of Americanism, and lump them together with the people who openly are contemptuous of American principle. Divide those two sources of people, and there's an enduring center-right majority. Lump them together, as has been the wont too often in the last 40 years, and you create a near majority for the opposition that continually has fissures. And when the left runs that, you see people in the center left move away and be open to voting for the center right. But if you lump those two together, there is a near majority, but it's not something that's in their hearts. It's something that's forced upon them by the political construct that we are creating for them. Yes, Dr. Spaulding.
Thank you, Henry. Could you talk a little bit about how, both in the past and currently, you perceive it occurring? One of the key aspects of this that you imply but didn't touch on as much is how the populist sentiment is incorporated into the party system.
Yeah.
It's no coincidence that the critical elections you mentioned all became actively in control of one of the political parties, whereas opposed to, say, William Jennings Bryan, never quite took hold.
Right.
So that aspect of becoming part and parcel of a major political party is an important aspect of it. How in the current day do you see that occurring? Is that a problem? How does it interact with the political party system?
I think what we're seeing today is attempts by these people to retake control of the political parties. That both, if you were to sit down and put people from the Center American Progress and people from Freedom Works in the same room, they would both argue that the leaders of their party are too much in control by elites who don't care about what the average person is. And that they're trying to do is restore popular control over their particular political party. We have a unique opportunity to do that through the primary system here. that essentially our open primary system is unique in America. It allows hostile takeovers of political parties by people. I don't think the problem is one of, I think the problem why it does not happen is we have not yet found a political movement and a political discourse that is both persuasive enough and broad-based enough to allow for those political victories to be the sort of regular sort of political victories that produce a coalition. In other words, it's not our current problem is not one of a shortfall of structure, but it's a shortcoming of statesmanship by the people who purport to be trying to restore the rule. Does that answer your question? It needs to be both. The populist movements need to be both mature in the manner in which they pursue political power, and once they pursue political power, it needs to be done in a way that the people who they have in some way dispossessed reconcile themselves to that. This is what Ronald Reagan classically did, which was that in mobilizing popular conservatism to retake the Republican Party, he did it on terms that allowed the reconciliation with the elite elements of the Republican Party, unlike Barry Goldwater, who openly tried to repudiate them. And consequently, when you're told that you're not welcome at the party, you try and hold on to your party. The elites in the Republican Party accommodated themselves to Reaganism precisely because of the statesmanship of the leader of conservative populism.
You bring so many questions up. I agree. I'll start with where you ended with Reagan, because I would say what Reagan did was create a new elite. He did not turn America
unique.
He created a new elite, a new conservative elite. He did not turn, the White House over to Andrew Jackson's hillbilly, shall I say? But I'm glad, Matt. Well, first question is the failure of the three movements right now. Is that a failure of populism itself, or is that a failure of the program that is not catching on with the public? I would say that populism has failed to a large degree because both class struggle, class envy, and vengeance have not been part of the American way to settle scores. With the three you mentioned, there were safety valves. I mean, Jefferson did buy half the country, so he inflated his electorate. He had lots of land to give out, and they all became Democratic Republican states. Whatever one says about Jackson, the motivation for that Indian Removal Act was rewarding Georgia farmers with land that was available. So there was a safety valve. And of course, with FDR, you do it through the income tax. Now, all you've said so far was about the economic side. I'm glad you mentioned Bryan, because the election of 1896 is extremely interesting. You had lots of others. It starts with the big bad bankers on Wall Street. You read the populist press, you see lots of reference to Jewish bankers and international conspiracies, and bankers have no country and all that, which leads to the revival of the KKK, which they never talk about Bryan. 1824, we loved the KKK, the same year at the Scopes trial, where they're trying to deal with, get Darwin out of the schools, and we're back to that to some degree, and anti-immigration, anti-legal immigration, and restrictive quotas. Democrats love to grab the Bryan part of the redistribution aspect. Roosevelt had Bryan's family to his White House to say, here's your grandfather's program. I've enacted it all. But of course, he didn't mention these nasty sides of it. So I guess my question is it the failure of populism, or is it the failure of these three groups, or the failure of the American people, if you want, the American character, to embrace class struggle, class envy, and vengeance as a policy?
I don't think populism is. This is why the solution of the positive agenda that is consistent with American aspirations is crucial to the success of a populist movement. I recall, I didn't mention 1896, and I didn't mention 1896 because there's only so much time, and that actually requires a lot more. But that was an attempted populist moment that failed. And I think it was an attempted populist moment that largely failed precisely because the agenda that he advanced, including government ownership of railroads, of government ownership, of a telegraph, was something that threatened the idea of American self-determination. So what McKinley was able to do was recreate the Lincoln Coalition for his time, and basically replacing the Homestead Act, with, the Homestead Act and the railroad with the tariff. That this is how, with a high industrial tariff, we will give you, quote unquote, a full dinner pail. Your security and ability to advance is met by our agenda, not by their radical agenda. And that is, in fact, why Bryant populism failed and why McKinley was able to reconstruct Lincoln populism for the early industrial age. With respect to the current element, I think you put your nail on the head in why I think none of the current populisms currently on hand can address the question, which is to say that we may need to reconcile ourselves to the idea that widely spread, purely private sector growth for people without educations is not coming in the next 30 years. The Trump and the Cruz form of populism basically assumed that. Cruz through his, through the reduction in government, that we will see this restoration of not only numerically high growth, what Jeb Bush likes to say, 4% rather than 2%. Although I will say, on this week of St. Crispin's Day, I don't think anyone ever goes into the bloody breach for 4% growth. But the assumption is, get this out of the way, and everything that we've experienced from the post-war era will come back. Well, that's why I bring up the Bush era. It wasn't there in the Bush era. It may not be coming back. And Trump, the same thing. I'll do a better trade deal. I'll kick these people who are, basically, he's arguing that the problem is competition. You're being unfairly competed against by foreigners living here, immigrants, and living abroad, free trade. I'll deal with the unfair competition and growth will come back. Well, that may not be true either. Or to the extent it is true, it would be true only in the short term by adopting an autarkic, mercantilist, Peronist economy, which would produce a short-term gain and long-term death. And then you've got Sandersism, which basically says our solution is redistribution, that the problem is income, the problem is not opportunity. None of these deal with the mixture of the need to secure some form of decent share of the wealth so that people who are citizens feel part of the citizen project, with the American need, the crucial need for human freedom, that most of that come from private endeavor. I don't think that is the safety valve. And we may not have a safety valve because we may be in a state where we're going to have to adjust for the next 30 or 40 years to 3 billion people becoming half as wealthy as we are, which is where China and India and Vietnam and Malaysia and Mexico and all of these countries are on the course of being that. In 30 years, they will be half as wealthy as we are. What does it look like to adjust in that world, to maintain the American virtues, not to fall prey to Peronism or not to abandon our virtues, but at the same time to recognize that people are part of a shared whole of citizenship and that it is unacceptable that in a democratic political system that some people go backwards while other people go forward. It is fine if people go forwards at different rates. But if some people go backwards and others go forwards, people who are going backwards will vote to stop going backwards. And the more elites ignore that, the more they give rise to the demand for classical populism. That will be the death of the American regime. Yeah. Could you wait for, I'm sorry, it's just they have the microphones and they're taping, so thank you.
Hopefully I don't hold it too close. To what extent do you see automation as complicating us being able to find dignified work for the unskilled? It was a number of years ago, President Obama derided ATMs as replacing bank tellers. But that's true.
Yeah.
And in Seattle, with the increase in the minimum wage, they're pricing service workers out of business.
Right.
I mean, I go to check out my groceries, and I check them out.
Yeah, I like to say that productivity consists primarily of giving man a machine. That's what industrialization was putting carbon-based human labor behind industrial machines that could multiply their effort. And that's what creates productivity. That's what's happening in the third world, is we're taking people behind, we're taking people from behind yaks and sticking them in factories and giving them rudimentary machines. If we have machines that can work in and of themselves, that produces an even a greater issue. Clearly, that'll produce great opportunity for the people who build and fix and design the machines. What we need to do as a society is treat the people who might have lesser opportunities with dignity. And that may mean that we move towards a system of wage top-off to preserve that balance between staying ahead and private entrepreneurship, as opposed to a safety net, which rewards people only when they give up. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I think to close your eyes to the possibility that we have new challenges and that old ways are sufficient to meet them is to build the demand for classical populism. The left's argument right now is to ignore that challenge and to force higher minimum wages, which will have effects that they don't want to recognize. But it is a legitimate attempt to try and deal with this question. I think it's one that statesmen need to look at very seriously. What does the rise of intelligent machines mean for the liberal democratic West? Tyler Cowen, in his book, The Average is Over, presents a very stark, angry, and I find entirely unattractive view, which is basically say, this is the way life is going to be, deal with it. He says it's going to be less equal, less fair, and there's nothing we can do about it. Right. I mean, that essentially, what essentially means is that there is a risk the more intelligent the machines become. And we're not there yet. It's not going to happen in our lifetime. But the risk is the more intelligent the machines become, the less need people with education and ability have of less skilled people, because they would have slaves. So long as the dystopic visions of machines becoming self-aware and launching Judgment Day and all that stuff that dominates science fiction on the movies today, as long as that doesn't come true, you basically get slaves. So if you've got slaves, what do you do with the people who you used to give money to in order to help you live a better life? That may be a challenge for the next generation. It's not our challenge here. Our challenge here is to manage the changes that we're dealing with so that we maximize freedom and comfort for people, not just in our country, but also overseas. But that is something that the next generation may have to deal with. Yes, sir. Before I give you another chance, does somebody else have a question? Because we're running out of time, and I don't want to give somebody else, give you an extra question when nobody else. Okay, this lady has a question, so if you don't mind, I'll let her ask it. And yeah. Can you wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned populism. How many, a percentage, in your estimate, of the American population understand it? How many percent understand it, fallen away from understanding that our Americanism system of government? And I guess it's a threefold question. And how much of the threats IO, information operations, is succeeding in dumbing down the American populace to where they can't even make an educated difference of understanding even the four populist positions?
Yeah.
What's the percentage, do you think, of Americans that understand our form of government?
What I tried to do was apply kind of, a taxonomic view, the way I would analyze things as a political scientist. I don't think that anyone, if you went to Trumpism, if you went to a Trump rally and said, do you understand the four elements of populism and how your movement fits into it? I think the number of people who would, it'd be like, what? Huh? What? I think there is a very strong sense right now of a disconnect between all segments of elite society and American ideals. And I think that is something that is understood, that is very widespread, and that what the political order is trying to do is groping towards a solution to that issue. But I think, what the people themselves understand is not going to be something that would be expressed in a political science article, but is something that is very real, which is that the people who are the people who are making decisions about my lives don't know about my life and don't care about my life, and I'm going to do something about it. And that is at heart what the demand side of populism ultimately in America is about. I think they have enough information to know that. I think I have to cut it off now because it's about 1 o'clock, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry, for a great talk. I will just quickly mention two things coming up. On November 5th, Joseph LeConte with King's College will be doing an evening event on A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and a Great War, talking about the relationship between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis in the midst of World War I. And our next AWC lecture is William Vogley, who's the senior editor of the Claremont Review of Books. We'll be here on November 12th, talking about liberalism and conservatism in the run-up to 2016. Thank you. Have a great day.